Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Dino's Tinker Shed. Now, in the last video, I introduced you to the series of refurbishments that we're going to be doing to a small gas-powered generator that my daughter and son-in-law brought down for me to have a look. Now, when they bought their house, this generator came with it. It was sort of a backup generator because it's out in the country. But when we really looked at it, it was in pretty rough shape, and the carburetor and the fuel tank were pretty dirty, so they asked if I could freshen it up for them. Now, really all we needed to do is get this thing running, but I thought it might be a good opportunity for us to take a look at what a small refurbishment project like this really entails. So in part one, we basically power washed and cleaned the unit up, and we looked it over to make a list of tasks that we think that we need to do, and we've done that. Now also, we made a list of replacement parts that we think we're going to need for this, or at least what we know we're going to need. There could be some things hiding in the weeds here. But I've ordered those parts and I'm waiting for those to arrive. Now, ultimately, we were able to break the unit into two separate parts: the frame itself and the generator unit. So now in this episode, we're going to turn our attention to that frame unit. We're going to clean it up, straighten a few components that look like they've been bent from past use, and ultimately we'll give it a fresh paint job and maybe a new set of tires just to get it rolling a little better. And that'll probably take us to the end of this video. I don't want to make these too long, and I think it's important to note again that this isn't a full museum restoration here. I'm just trying to clean this up to make it presentable and help protect the investment that's within that generator. If you've been out to price one of these things lately, a 13 horsepower generator is well over $1,000 to buy. So for the few parts that we've had to order, I think it's going to be a great value for them as their young family grows. Okay everybody, enough talking here. Let's get to work. Alright, so now that I've got the generator unit separated from the frame, you can really see there's a lot of loose paint and a little bit of rust here and there, and there's still some dirt that was hiding underneath the generator unit. So that's easy to fix, and I'm going to do that with our pressure washer here. Now, I'm going to use a rotator tip on this particular part of the project. I want the maximum pressure I can get to knock all the loose dirt and pieces of flaking paint that you're going to see here, or powder coating. Now, it doesn't look like it's rotating because it's matching the frame rate of my camera, but you get about a 15-degree cone at maximum pressure here, and it really does a great job of getting all the dirt off. Now, I'm going to follow this up with an air hose again just to get all the air or all the water out of all the nooks and crannies here before we move to disassembly. Now, with any project, you're going to want to dismantle this down as far as you can if you're planning on painting it. Now, I'm going to take all the handles and bracketry off of the frame here, and it's pretty easy. Just keep track of the parts like we've talked about, put them in bags so you know where they go, and you can quickly disassemble a frame like this down to its rudimentary parts. These feet here were bent. I had to take these off anyway to straighten them up. We're going to do that a little bit later in the video. But you can kind of see they come apart really easy. There's only a couple bolts, and just about any project you're going to do, it's the same process. And once I break it down, I'm just going to use a little bit of brake cleaner here just to get any residue off before I move into the sanding process, which you're going to see here. Now, there is all kinds of ways to do this. Right here, I'm just using a little bit of Scotch-Brite to sort of give the area some tooth, but there's all kinds of different products you can use, from manual wire brushes, scrapers, sandpapers, working up to Dremel tools. There's a lot of assorted tips you can get for that. I use drills and wire brushes quite a bit, and I do use a Rotolock head on an angle die grinder to get into a lot of the little spots, and ultimately my biggest tool is that angle grinder itself. Now, as you pinch things or want to hold things, I use the vise quite a bit. And you'll see I used a little socket there to help hold this piece in place. And the flap wheel does a great job on these angled pieces. Now what I'm trying to do here, I'm not trying to get all the powder coating off. I'm just trying to get off all the flaking pieces and actually get it to a reasonably smooth transition between the powder coating and bare metal. So you'll see I switch between wire brushes and flap wheels and drills and angle grinders. You're going to need a few different tools, but you can really do all of this just with a wire brush. And some pieces like this end cap of the generator unit, all it needed was a little bit of cleaning with some brake cleaner. Now once you get the loose paint off, I turn my attention to straightening the pieces. Now these feet here had been bent, not badly, but enough that they needed to be straightened. This is pretty much bowl work. You can use whatever tools are in your shop, but a bench vise makes this so much easier because it'll hold the piece for you while you straighten it up. And it's really just a bunch of little taps and twists until you get it to the point where you feel it's decent. For me, now this looked pretty good. Now the battery tray, if you remember, was bent pretty bad. It had been shoved in. So I actually took the battery tray off and it looks pretty bad here. It's pretty rusty and there's a lot of peeling powder coating on here, but overall it wasn't too bad. The worst part were the fact that those supports had been bent up and pushed back into the frame. So I started by just getting all the loose paint off with a wire brush here and sort of assessing the condition of the overall tray. Now it's pretty thick metal compared to some other parts, so it really wasn't too bad. I just went along and cleaned up and wire brushed what I could, and then I turned my attention to those bent straps. And this again is where a bench vise is so handy. It's one of my favorite tools to have in a shop. It's hard to do without it once you have one, because basically it's a third hand. And you can see here, I just sort of hammer and bend the pieces down until they're flat straps again. And when you're hitting on your bench vise, it's best to use the anvil portion if it has one. These things are made out of cast iron. They can crack if you beat on them too much. And here I'm actually using it as a bit of a press to straighten that piece out. Now there are some cases where you need to put something like this body dolly in the vise. And you'll see I tap very lightly here. I don't want to crack the jaws of my vise. Any hard hitting, I go back to the anvil portion, which is designed to be hit. And then I finish this off with the grinder and a cup brush. It gets into all the little nooks and crannies, and then I straighten up the support pieces that hold the tray and register it in place. Now there was a lot of bent pieces on this. Now those support pieces I take over to the bench grinder's wire wheel. Sometimes it's easier to bring the part to the tool than the tool to the part. Now here I'm actually taping off the hand grips in preparation for paint. Now this is a pretty easy process. It's just going to keep it off the grips and makes the job look a little more professional when you're done. Painting, the biggest thing with painting is cleanliness. I clean everything with brake cleaner before I paint it. So one thing that I forgot to show in the video, or at least I thought I captured it on video and I can't seem to find it anywhere, is the fact that before I painted all these surfaces, I actually used a rust converter. So what rust converter does is it converts that red oxide rust into black oxide, and it stops it from sort of spreading. Now it's not a fail-safe. The best way is to grind all the way down to fresh metal, but I'll be honest with you, this thing is so pitted and gnarled in some spots, it made more sense to use this type of a product. Now it goes on really easy, it dries clear, it's hard to see, but believe me, it's actually on the product. So anyway, it's a good thing to have in your inventory when you need it. When it finally comes time to paint, I use a little bit of machinist wire on a basically a rod that I attach to a ladder to hold things up. And I always use long strokes and I come off the end of each part so that I don't end up with a gob of paint at the end of the part. And I hang them out here on this little rod. So you can see I do the same process with the feet here, and I use sort of strokes that come off the end of the product, the longest stroke that I can get for each component and each part of that component. By far, the frame is the hardest thing to paint. It has so many angles and little crevices, you want to make sure you capture as much as you can. Now I paint the bottom of it first so that I can let that dry and ultimately flip it up on sawhorses. Now overall I did about 3 coats of paint on each part. Light coats just basically to cover it, and it's ready to go. Here I am cleaning the battery tray with brake cleaner. Now check to make sure brake cleaner is compatible with the paint that you're using. For what I am, it does good, and I use an air hose just to dry it off a little bit quicker, and it gets the same treatment. Long continuous strokes off the end of the product so that you don't get drips. Now I did end up with some drips. Again, I tinker on stuff. I'm not a pro painter, just like I'm not a pro welder. But I think overall, when I was done, the parts came out pretty good. You can see here, overall it's pretty smooth, the paint's nice and glossy, and I'm quite comfortable with the outcome of the paint job. So I hope you like it. Okay, the paint's dried, and now we're going to reassemble things. So I start with the feet here. I've already put the rubbers on the bottom, as you can see. And it's just a matter of going in and reassembling all of the components. Now, where I needed to, I used new fasteners. The ones that were in decent shape, I cleaned up on the wire wheel, and then I put everything back together as a loose fit. Once I'm happy with that fit, I will come back and retighten everything. And this is really important. When you're reassembling a project, sometimes loose fasteners allow you to get the other fasteners into the holes before you tighten them up. I've made that mistake before where I tighten things first, and you have to come back and re-loosen them because you can't quite get one bolt through a hole. Now the feet obviously aren't a big concern, but it's just a good point to make so when you're working on your project, you don't make the same errors I do. Now the battery tray still needs a bit of work. I've straightened those straps out, but the battery tray needs to sit about here. So I need to make a couple strategic bends right about this point. So I measure it out, it's about 1 inch deep. And I use the bench vise to just start to get that initial angle. Now I come back and touch up any damage that the hammer and the vise make, but I make a bend, I'll go over to the actual unit and I'll try it and see how it fits. And I do this over and over. Now eventually I get it to a point where I like the angle, and I bolt it in place. Now I've already bent the tray as well at the top, you'll see here, so it sits relatively level. I bolted it in place because it was close enough that I could come back and tweak it once I got those particular pieces tightened up. So once I get that in place, I put the control arms, and you'll see here I just bend it ever so slightly at both the bottom and the top to get it to fit. And you'll find this is pretty common with projects like this. You can move things around and muscle them around to get them to work for you. And again, here I just fasten everything up and get it completed. Now the frame's done, I want to turn my attention to these tires. So you'll see I've got replacement tires here, but if you look, it's missing one of the sort of axle extensions that the original tires had, so I'm going to have to reuse the rims. So what I'll do is I'll split these rims apart. These are a 2-piece rim. They're really easy to get apart. There's just a nut and a bolt, actually 4 nuts and a bolt that go through these, and I'll just sort of undo them all. Now what's funny here is I didn't drain the air out of the tire, and so when I got the last bolt out, the tire actually exploded open like that. You can kind of see how wide it is here. It was a lesson I just wasn't thinking about at the time. It caught me off guard. So I used a valve stem removal tool here, and I'll pull the valve stem out of the inner tube, and you'll see it quickly just deflates down to where it should be. You should really do this before you take these tires apart, but no harm, no foul. So once I get it apart, there's quite a bit of rust in here, and this is tricky. I tried first with one of these wire brushes on my drill, and it got sort of down into the corners. It did a good job of removing the rust, but it was hard to get into every single corner. You can kind of see me struggling here, and this was actually a pretty hard piece to clamp in the vise. So I kind of had to do it by hand. I probably should have had gloves on there, but I didn't. What can I say? So I cleaned it up. I got it reasonably good. And then I turned my attention to the other half. Now the other half has the extensions attached to it, the axle extension. So in order to get in there, I used this small cup brush. It wasn't perfect, but I was able to sort of walk my way around. And the nice thing is here, again, I could clamp it into the vise to give me a bit of a hand. And then I used some emery paper just to sand those axle extensions where the bearings are located. And I just kept going back and forth, use a bit of brake cleaner, clean out the rust that I had shaken loose, and eventually I got these to a pretty clean state. You can see here now I'm cleaning the inside of this part of the hub, and I'll come back in and actually clean this axle shaft side up as well with a little bit more emery cloth. And this is a good technique for round components that you need to sand. Emery cloth comes in a big roll, you just rip a piece off, and you can go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to cover up the bearing ends with some masking tape here before I paint them, and guess what? We're off to painting. Now it was starting to spit rain a little bit, so I came up with this little idea where I used some unistrut or Telspar, sorry, that slid inside each other. I could paint them outside because I don't like to paint in my shop. The drift can get on all kinds of things. So I quickly went through and painted these. It wasn't the best job, I'll be honest. There's a few spots that are missing, but I was trying to get ahead of the rain here. So I painted them up. I painted them red just because I think it looks good. And then I had a matching piece of this Telspar that was in my bench vise. I brought them in and slid it in and let them dry. While the rims dried, I turned my attention to the axle shafts, and I cleaned these up with some emery cloth as well, just so that I could the bearings would slide on well. And then I lubricated all of the axle shafts with some grease. This is mostly to stop them from rusting, and as you slide the bearings on, it'll smush this grease around. So now that the tires are dry, I'll take them and I'm going to load up the inside of these rim bearings here with a little bit of grease. So I use a paintbrush. I can just sort of wiggle it around into the back, and then as I slide it on, I'll turn the bearings so it smushes that grease around. And I put in some new hardware here. Basically, it's just a lock washer, a flat washer, and a new nut, just to clean things up. And these don't have to be ripping tight. They just need to be snug enough so they won't fall off. This isn't obviously going to see any highway use. It's basically just a wheelbarrow. So I'll tighten those up, and you'll see the axle does move a little bit here. It's just not clamped in quite tight enough, but it's good enough for what I'm doing. Okay, look at that. It's a rolling chassis again, and it is ready for reinstallation of the power unit. I'm pretty excited. I hope you are too. Okay, I think that about wraps us up for today's video. We got a lot of things accomplished. If you look back, we were able to straighten up the battery tray and the feet for the actual frame. We were able to clean the overall frame up, prime it, and get a reasonably good coat of paint on it. At least it's going to protect it for years to come. And it's nothing to stop my son-in-law or daughter from giving it a little bit of a paint job every once in a while just to keep it going. Now in the next episode, we're going to switch our attention over to the engine. And we're going to get that thing running if we can. We're going to look at the trinity of fuel, ignition, and compression. If we have all three of those things, there's a pretty good chance that we're going to be able to get this thing running. So until next time, I'm Dino for Dino's Tinker Shed. You have a great day, and I hope to see you soon. Bye now.